like that's a good question because it was something I didn't quite know what to expect when I started it. I started the Hajj Trail coding it with someone from my cohort at Yale when I was in my last year of graduate school, and his name was Russ Gastia, and he had a little bit of background in coding, and so we were chatting about my dissertation on 17th century Ottoman sovereignty in the Hijaz. I had some chapters of my dissertation were based on pilgrimage narratives, and I was talking about the things that happen in these narratives, these travel accounts, and he had, said to me jokingly, "Oh, that sounds like the Oregon Trail." And the Oregon Trail is like a 1990s educational game that most Americans, and depending on what state you grew up in, played. I grew up playing it in fifth grade in my elementary school because I grew up in Minnesota, which is actually the state in the US that developed it in the 1980s, essentially as an educational tool. And it's a travel game. You go from point A to point B, and different events happen to you along the way. And there was a way in which that became a very easy thing in my mind to be like, oh, well, the journey to Mecca in sort of a historical comparison has the many similar things. It's easy to tell a story of mobility and travel through a game. You have a goal for the player, start here, go to the end, events happen to you in between, and those events that happen to you can teach you about the experience of travel or mobility. And so we sort of joked that, oh, it'd be easy to code. It wouldn't take so long to make a game like Hajj Trail. It took much, much longer, hundreds of hours of coding and also further research to basically transform parts of my dissertation research really into this sort of interactive tool. At the same time, I was also starting teaching, and when you're starting to teach, you're trying to think of different engaging tools to show to your students. And one of the big problems is that, people that do US history or European history or other places, there's games and plenty of media out there that you can pull into the students to engage with in different ways. And there was very little outside of some film and stuff for the Ottoman world, and especially for the early modern Ottoman world, especially for the Hajj in the 17th century. And so it sort of became also sort of project of, okay, I'm starting to teach, I can make this educational game to sort of incorporate some of the lessons I've learned in my research and communicate to them, to my students, in a very different way. So that's how the whole sort of Hajj Trail project started, as sort of which is basically mostly just done through HTML, a little bit JavaScript, and through the platform Twine, which is an interactive storytelling platform, which for me, as someone that was new to coding at the time, was a very nice visual organization of a branching narrative for me to sort of visualize how I'm going to connect, when you go from Istanbul to Üsküdar, what events could happen to you in between. Those are the types of things that Twine made it very easy for me to start writing out a story in a sort of text-based game form. And that's something that I always tell folks of, if they want to get into just designing their own historical narratives or games, start with Twine. It's a very easy platform to build from and to learn as well. One of the things that became most surprising to me while developing the Hajj Trail was that in my dissertation, and I'm sure this happens to many folks as they're doing research, you read a primary source, a historical account, and you're like, okay, this pilgrim, say Yusuf Nabi, one of the 17th century pilgrims, Istanbul to Mecca, and you skimming through, okay, where did he go? What did he experience? And he spends most of the time, the longest sections of his account will be, Damascus, Aleppo, Istanbul, Medina, and then finally when he gets to Mecca. And there's this way in which, just as a story, when you're looking at oh, good, he's talking about the big places, and there's this almost extra focus on these big cities, these big places that we know that sort of were the urban centers of the Ottoman world. And so that sort of plays out, I think, in the bias of the source of what he chooses to write about as someone in the 17th century of hey, people want to know about my time in Aleppo or Damascus. And also for the modern historian, who's also almost has this, especially Ottoman studies, has this urban bias as well in looking at these big urban centers. But when coding the Hajj Trail, you're building in every single stop. So you're going through that same exact travel narrative, like Yusuf Nabi or even like Evliya Çelebi, and you have to provide content. You have to provide something for the player to see in each of these way stations or caravanserais along the way. 10 hours of travel here, 10 hours of travel there, something happens, you have to describe what the place looks like, you have to describe what types of buildings were there, what types of local shrines were there that made up this experience for pilgrims. And in like Yusuf Nabi, that one place might be 1 or 2 lines of text that he provides about his experience there. But we know just from his itinerary that he spent 10 hours getting there, a whole day there, and then 10 hours continuing beyond that. But he spent the vast majority of the time that pilgrims are traveling from Istanbul to Mecca is not going to be in Aleppo, Konya, or Damascus. They spend lots of time there. Sometimes they stay longer because they're family or friends, but the majority of the time is spent in these places in between, which the bias of the sources, they don't think it's interesting. They probably thought it was boring. Like, countryside, way station, on my way to the big city of Konya or something. But there's a way in which the time investment in these places was significant, and the sources overlook it in a sense to some degree, and then the bias of modern historians also overlook it because, hey, he doesn't spend that much time writing about it, so I don't have to write about it much in my research. So by coding the Hajj Trail, it forced me to examine those places in between. I defined, okay, what did Yusuf Nabi say about this place? What did Evliya say about this place? What did other travelers say about this place, to get a sense of, okay, glue a bunch of different travel narratives together of how did they all experience this one small way station, small shrine in between these major cities. Because you can't just have the player click through the Hajj Trail game and there's just like a blank thing for one of the stations because, hey, they didn't talk about it much, so we're just gonna skip over it. You don't have the luxury of skipping over things in a game that's trying to sort of represent to you every single stop someone stopped at. While you can in a chapter, in a book you're writing, you can be like, well, I don't have enough to write about that place. We're just going to talk about the next place that's more interesting. And so that sort of, for me, also like, that's what I want my second like research side of things, book project, to be, to look at these places in between, try to find some sigils, and sort of how these places how are they changed by this international route of pilgrims traveling through them seasonally. But there's this way in which it reshaped how I looked at my own sources, how I looked at the history of the Hajj, and it was through the process of coding a game that did that. And because it forced me into, there's a notion in game design and talking to some folks that do game development or historical research background people for games, and they talk about how, like, if you create like a market scene in a video game, and especially if it's all visualized, you can't just have like historians like a grayed out area because, like, we just don't know what that looks like. You are forced to make choices and historical assumptions about, okay, what was around here, you're forced to do more research about, like, okay, how do I fill in all the blanks, because you can't, for the player, have these obvious blank spaces, which you can do in historical writing. You can be, it's very normal it's very good for a story to be like, hey, we don't know enough about this place, or this one source doesn't talk enough about it, and there's no need to dig into like 5 other sources to sort of scrounge other material to sort of create a full picture. And so that's the biggest thing for me, and that was really fundamental in how the game sort of played out in coding it and developing it, and also then how, say, in the lessons I learned from coding and designing the Hajj Trail, how that's been shaped by that experience as well. Because that's something that, yeah, I could have gotten to that notion or thinking about in a different way, these Hajj accounts, that was surprising, that I wasn't expecting. I was expecting, going into starting that project, as just, hey, I'm just gonna take these sources and then plot them onto this game, and then someone can basically read the sources as while clicking through them, basically. That was the sort of general mindset, and I didn't realize it would sort of also change how I historically think about the impact of the journey to Mecca on these non-major places that even the pilgrims or travel writers themselves don't spend much time writing about, but from their itineraries that they spend a lot of time in these places. And so it's sort of that looking between the lines type stuff that historians love to do. So. Yeah, the markets were a fundamentally difficult thing to construct because there's a game element to them to keep you engaged, essentially. So the learning outcome of the marketplaces is that you have some sense of like what is a prominent good or product that this region or this place is known for. So by giving you different options, you're constantly saying, hey, there's a new thing here, and you're connecting it to that place. And most of those items, almost all of them, are from Evliya Çelebi in some way. So Evliya is basically creates the inventory for random things you come across. There's a few places where when I'm doing background research on a place, I'm like, hey, they're known for this type of product, and I'll build it in even if Evliya or another traveler doesn't mention it. So there's a few places where I'm like, hey, I want something unique here. And I sort of dig it a little bit more, look through anthropological research of what is this region specifically known for. But lots of it comes from Evliya. The prices, there was a point in time early in the Hajj Trail where I was like, I'm gonna do real Ottoman prices, and especially in the 17th century with rampant Ottoman inflation, that wasn't gonna happen. It was gonna be a lot. So the basic function of it, which I'm very proud that it functionally works, because when we first made the first build of the Hajj Trail, you could just buy something and sell it for enormous profit, and we never had to worry again. It was very broken, but basically I have a very large spreadsheet where I created price changes between if you buy something in a small town to a big city, and then if you also transfer that same item from big city to a different region. And so functionally making it the aspect that if you seek out something that is not in a major center, a small place, you can make some sort of profit if you bring it to a small amount of profit if you bring it to the big marketplace, the big bazaar. And then you make even more profit if you bring it further and further afield from where you initially bought it. So it multiplies. If you buy something in small town in Rumelia, and you carry it with you all the way to Mecca, the player is rewarded with greater profit to try to sort of give some incentive for holding on to things, for being hey, I brought this all the way from here. There is one thing that goes the opposite direction, which is coffee, which is if you do pick up coffee in the Balkans and you're hey, I got this coffee, and you bring it all the way to Arabia, you will lose money because that's where coffee comes from at the time. So there's one secret reverse. There is sort of game studies research that shows definitively that having a student make a choice is going to help them remember information better. So the process of choice, and games are all about choice, and that choice can be simple as go left, go right. That could be as simple as you choose which item to buy. That could be, those moments of choice, which some scholars in game studies, Jeremiah McCall comes to mind, who writes about what he calls the historical problem space, where basically you get into this point in the game where the player has to make a choice, some big decision, and then making that choice will help them remember that better, even if it's very simple. So there's a way in which games play a role that is fundamentally different than a book or even a lecture, for instance, for a student on a topic, that it can help them understand the world that is being built for them. As I always say to folks, that when historians write, they're also doing world building. We do not live in the 17th century. You're presiding to the reader, what is the 17th century like? Here are these different sources that I'm building it for you to paint a picture. And games do that. Obviously, games play with fiction in a very different way than historical writing, but they're both doing world building. They're both sort of speaking to someone that hasn't lived that place and time. And so there's a sort of, I think, a fundamental role that sort of games can play in education for students in helping them retain information better. It's a very similar sort of process of if you listen to a lecture, yeah, maybe you'll get some of it, but if you listen to the lecture and then take notes And even if you never look at those notes again, your brain is making a choice of what to write down. That's also choice making, and that will help you remember it better. So it's the same thing with games. And so, for instance, that's where, presenting a marketplace, for instance, as I talked about already, you have all these items. And by giving the player the choice to choose between, apricots or, I don't know, like a manuscript or something, by giving them choices that they, even in a millisecond, have to think through in their brain of, oh, these are the things here, they're associating those things as important. They have value in society, that they're maybe connected to that place that they're in. They're building in all these things or assumptions through it. And that's very important in games. And I think how, the Hajj Trail is meant to provide a vision of the historical imagination of the Ottoman world to students and players who might not think of the Ottomans, especially in the 17th century, in any sort of meaningful capacity. They maybe only experience them in media through films that depict war, through games that are all about war and cannons and gunpowder. It's like in any video game, for instance, if you make a marketplace, and that marketplace in this town only sells knives, swords, and gunpowder weapons, that person's going to associate with that society in that town with violence, with warfare. It's dangerous because I have to buy all these things there. But if you recreate that town and you say, well, this town sells apricots, various jams, ice cream, things like this, that also creates for the player a different assumption of what the society is like. And so that's why lots of the items play, I think, a significant role of just sort of trying to represent through people like Evliya Çelebi of how he would think. He goes through these very long lists of like things you get from this place, things you get from this town, but it does paint a very different picture than I think lots of modern media does for the Ottomans, especially in games where the Ottomans are only associated with, like, they have cannons, they're an empire, and that's what most people get from it. So those choices of you having to choose items, of you having to choose, like when you go to a town, there's a marketplace, there's a coffee house to be like, hey, this is the social center of the Ottoman world. There's a local shrine there, to sort of marking the sacred geography of the Ottoman world. These are things that are, everything that's put in the game is a choice by the game designer. And the goal is that even by seeing those options, the player will also have choices of what to choose, what to go to. And that is going to implicitly shape how they imagine what are the values of the Ottoman world. Like the towns are set up of what you can interact with, are meant to sort of present to the player, hey, what are the institutions of an Ottoman urban space? The imaret, the waqf, the bazaar, these different things that sort of shape Ottoman urban space. That is the purpose of having those choices there for the player. And so there's ways in which obviously this can all be done through someone just taking a class. The goal of the Hajj Trail or Seyahat is to be a starting place for like either someone to use it with a class or just to randomly come across it and play it and maybe start that sort of point of learning or interest. But then they can read sort of books on the Ottoman world, take classes on the Ottoman world, things like this. So it's supposed to be that starting point, but it's supposed to start them in this sort of place of sort of really trying to highlight or put in the forefront sort of the social history of the Ottoman past for them. Yeah, I think there is a sort of, obviously what I'm doing with the Hajj Trail and now Seyahat is that it's very different in a sense that I'm an academic who's a teacher who's just trying to, without funding for these projects, just making them, sort of tying them to my research in different ways. And there's a nice element to that. I don't have there always be free games. There's no profit motive, game publisher who's like, no, you need to make this, more flashy or delete this historical context part or something, which can make obviously things more boring as well. And I do understand that, but there's a way in which having which is my hope is that more, I started making the Hajj Trail and then say, because this doesn't exist yet in a space. And the goal is that we get more academics to make sort of either interactive text stories about the past, more games about the past. There's newer tools in game design, which make it much more user-friendly for someone to just learn it quickly with a bunch of YouTube videos and then start making their own content with it. And I think it can be a very powerful tool. And I think prior to many things, like you see the Ottomans or the early modern world depicted in many games, but they're done by games companies. It's not to say that they're doing it bad. They just have different motives for why they're depicting the Ottomans in that game, and they may be more easily able to sort of cut different parts from a historical narrative because they're like, well, that's not what player expects. There's many things in sort of the gaming industry world where they will lean more into stereotypes rather than trying to push against those stereotypes, because they say, well, why would you don't want to make something that the player sees and then their already established imagination of the Ottomans that doesn't fit with it, and so it breaks their immersion. So they lean heavily into stereotypes, and so I think there's advantages in gamified sort of historical storytelling. I think there are also, of course, problems with it. You can go many different routes with it. People can be like, hey, Tyler, I like your research, but I don't like your game, or this different thing you chose. Like, I don't like this item you put in this marketplace because I feel like it doesn't represent that community. And that's a very fair criticism, because everything that goes in a game is a choice by the game designer. And I think there's, I've shown my research, I've done all these, put these things into the game, but I think there's at least more of a through line with like where I've taken stuff from and how I've put it in the game than what you can see with like a big games company making a game about the Ottoman world. That's not to say those are bad or that those are not useful. They still are useful for presenting the Ottoman world in a different way to gamers and players. But I think my hope is that more academics or researchers or historians get into historical game design, so we don't just leave it up to multi-million-dollar companies, or to just like put some Ottoman sort of art dressed up on something, or Orientalist art in a game, and just sort of release it to millions of people without any sort of research behind it. And it's not to say many games companies, including Assassin's Creed, they hire historical advisors, but they only have so much input. So they give input early on in a game's project, and then the art team might choose to go a different direction because they want to do a certain motif or design. And once an art asset is made in a game, because it's so much work to make an art asset, you as the historical advisor can't go, oh, you should change this, because that's it's labor someone's already done. So there's the advantages and disadvantages of sort of self-creating games as an academic, but and obviously the quality is much less than if I'm in a multi-million-dollar games company. But I think there's also some advantages that it gives me more freedom to sort of depict the Ottoman world the way in which I see the sources and secondary literature depicting it. I think in some way they will always be, and this is not in like a negative terminology, derivative of traditional historiography. Like the Hajj Trail, if you're an Ottoman historian, it's more fun for folks to play because you'll find all the Easter eggs of all the Ottoman history books I like in it, like different characters and people you meet. References to Karen Barkey's work, The Bandits of Bureaucrats, Tiana Kristich's work on contested conversions. There's all sorts of sprinkled throughout it. When you go to Eintep, you'll get the story from Leslie Pierce's work on the sigils of Eintep and stuff like that. So there's ways in which like different sort of secondary literature and then the primary source literature inform and create the Hajj Trail. But because games are not as a easily citable thing, I think it's not like someone could play the Hajj Trail and be like, hey, this quote that Tyler dug up for this one town that I include in the game from a primary source, they could use that, but the best bet is for them to just go directly to the source and cite that in their work. There's not a way in which I think it can easily advance a historical argument besides like maybe reframing the mindset. So there's a way in which there's an impact of them in that, like, hey, my second project will be about these, as I mentioned, these places in between, how these small sort of communities on the Hajj Road were transformed by this global route going through them. That is impact, but it's not this like direct, like, oh yeah, I'm citing the Hajj Trail or I'm citing Seyahat. And so I think there should be a space for them. I think that it should be taken seriously, but I think it's more similar along the lines of like film/documentary, because there is this sort of element of, if you, especially with Seyahat, you'll see this sort of go into more overdrive in how I've built it. Like the quotes I give you or different events, I'll have an option of extra info you can get for each dialogue option, and it will give you the definition of the key term, but also will give you in many cases like the books to read. Like there's a dream sequence in the demo of Seyahat, and there's a reference, and it will be like, hey, if you want to learn more about like Ottoman dreams, here's the citation for Niyaziolu's work, for Özgen Felek's work. And so like there's a way in which that's supposed to be like, hey, if you liked this little vignette, this like intro into this part of the Ottoman world, I've directly given you citations for books you can go to. And so it's engaging with the historiography, but it's never, I don't think it will ever be in a place where it can advance it, at least how I see it as like how just the medium works, just like how film or even documentary doesn't like advance historiography. Like it could make points or arguments and reshape how people write about it, but you never see, maybe this is a problem with academia, but you never see someone like citing it in like a historiographical essay or background, be like, oh, they'll be like, this was impactful and then these works came from it, but never that this was like the end all be all. So I think there's a space for games, but it's not this sort of, I think you put in your question, you said a complement to traditional historiography. I think it is a complement, but I don't think it contributes to it. That's how I'd say it. Is basically the Hajj Trail as I originally wanted to imagine it, but didn't have the capacity or ability to create it as such. One of my biggest issues with the Hajj Trail was that, and maybe there's an art historian that can go into this further, I tried to get images paired with each location the player goes to. So they have and I tried to prioritize Ottoman images of those places. And the Ottomans seem to love only depicting urban spaces. The Ottoman sort of visual depictions of rural spaces is lacking or difficult to find, which might sell you something about also who manuscript paintings are produced for in the palace, like what people were interested in seeing and stuff like this. But so there's places in the Hajj Trail where I ended up having to sort of go down the list of priority of what image to put there and go to 18th or 19th century European Orientalist painting, where they love doing like the landscape stuff like this. And I hated doing that because there's a way in which it's then implicitly telling the player that, hey, this landscape, you're visualizing it through this Orientalist lens by having this Orientalist painting in front of you on the screen. And so the Hajj Trail, I felt couldn't successfully break away from that by presenting the player a world in which, as best I can try to recreate, how someone in the 17th century, if you gave Evliya Çelebi the Unity game engine and told him to make his journey into an interactive game, how he would imagine it as best he can imagine. So Seyahat is basically trying to do the general story, if you will, many changes to it, of the Hajj Trail, but in an Ottoman-inspired visual style. So taken from 16th and 17th century Ottoman manuscript paintings, so that you're never sort of forcing the player to imagine an Ottoman landscape through like this random German painter's like imagination of Anatolia or something. And you're seeing it through the like beautiful like purple hills and all these colors of like an Ottoman manuscript painting. And so that was the goal of the Seyahat. And obviously by making the entire visual style of Seyahat it's a lot, honestly, a lot more work. I've also done that all as a solo developer for that as well. And through that, I had to learn the Unity game engine, C#. I used Inkscape for doing the artwork myself, and then also Inkle for the dialogue system, another program. And so it took me about a year to sort of pull those things together, and it really just took like someone, when I was spending like 2 years basically being like, hey, I want this other vision for the Hajj Trail, and trying to get funding for it to then pay like a games company to just do it on like a short timeline, a 6 to 12 month timeline. I got like estimates, talked to game developers, all these things, what it would cost, could never find funding for it. And eventually someone just told me, well, they were a teacher in game design, and they were telling me, well, my grad students just learn Unity and C# in like 6 months from YouTube videos. And I was like, hey, I've learned Osmanlıca, I can learn C# in the Unity game engine. So I started doing that. And so it became sort of this process of Seyahat is sort of like the vision of the Hajj Trail, and also the lessons I learned from game design and designing the Hajj Trail, like things I wanted to change. There's 2 sort of future projects I have in mind. One is the route of, say, I finish Seyahat, and I get like funding for it from someone to work with game developers and digital artists that I know. The goal would be to expand it, to connect it to Mughal and Safavid narratives as well, and also have the art style change as you travel through the world, from Mughal painting style and you travel to Safavid painting. And so that sort of change in the Ottoman world, that's like if I had funding and a team, that's what I would do, because I think that would be really cool and it tell interesting stories. The other route is, if not getting funding, I'll continue finishing out Seyahat, getting it to Mecca, building out that on Steam. And then the second project I'd want to work on is in a similar style. Presumably at that point I'll have learned a lot more tricks in coding and stuff that can do it slightly differently, but to do a narrative in the similar style to Seyahat of a Prisoner of the Infidels of Osman Aga of Timishvar, which I think is probably one of the most fantastic memoirs of the 17th/18th century Ottoman world, and his captivity from Ottoman Timishvar, getting captured by the Austrians, escaping his way back to the Ottoman lands. His narrative is so rich. I use it a lot as like a great, influence for content and some quotes and other things you see in the Hajj Trail and also in Seyahat. But I think it's such an amazing Ottoman narrative. I honestly think like probably the best written work of like the 17th century entire world. It's amazingly personal. The translation by Giancarlo Casale, also very expertly done. And that would be like, if I were to do like, hey, I have a game and I want to, it would just solely follow that one narrative. And I think it would be just like a very interesting way to display that story. So that would be like long-term, like second project, but there's many more moons to go for Seyahat, because it takes a long time to sort of make each scene. I do all the artwork and animation and stuff myself, so it is a lot, and I'm still like also going to redesign the user interface and stuff. So there's things I'm also changing from what's even out there on the demo at the moment as well. But yeah, those are like future projects or things I want to see exist in the world, whether it's by me or not. I just want things to exist. That's the fundamental goal. Yeah, like I don't know if there'll be a legacy someday, but like I hope other folks do it. Like the goal is that like I didn't do any coding. I didn't know any coding languages prior to my last year of graduate school and my PhD. Very late. And I was just like, this is a medium I think is good for telling historical stories of mobility. And I learned it. You watch YouTube videos, you lots of trial and error, and it's scary at first, but you can eventually make something that I think you can be like proud of. And so the goal is that I don't want to be the only person making Ottoman educational games. I want other folks to start doing it too. I think they're very valuable tools. I want to wake up one day and find someone has made this awesome educational tool for the early modern Ottoman world, like, I don't know, Qadi Court Simulator. I've always talked about doing that. Such rich materials, very easy design makeup, and you just get like people to work. I have that a little bit in Seyahat where you have to you give advice on a court case. But like there's ways in which there's many other sort of mechanisms you could do to sort of tell students in a different visual way and medium stories of the early modern Ottoman world. And I would love to wake up one day and be like, oh, I'm teaching this class. Oh, someone's made this awesome tool that I can just easily incorporate. And so, yeah, I hope people are like, hey, Tyler did it. Surely, like, I can do it too. Because that's what it took me, like, for Unity and learning Unity and artwork. I don't see myself as an artist. Being able to do the artwork and animation for Seyahat has been, yeah, it's not perfect, but I'm proud of it. And I was able to learn it on my own. And I think that's something that people should be like, hey, if this is something you're interested in, you can learn it, you can do it. It's scary at first because it's something very different than, especially if you're a trained academic, you're used to like very delineated projects and like things you're supposed to do to accomplish it. You've been trained your whole life of like write a paper, how to do research, but and it's much more of like an open book. But I think it's worthwhile, and I hope other people get involved and do things, or if I get funding, I'd be happy to have people on my team, but that seems like such a, there's a way in which I think funding for things like this, unfortunately at the moment, maybe this will change in the future, but the academic world in the funding models don't see it as like the same as other types of digital projects. So I think they're more hesitant to fund something that's an educational game. And then the games world doesn't want to fund something that is for free. They want to fund something that has like $20, $30, and they can make a profit from it. And I've always wanted to make free-to-play games because that's going to have the broadest reach. More people can use it, more people can engage with that historical material. So there's that sort of unfortunate space that it's in. So it's really like, but I think there is a growing sense that more and more spaces in academia will, especially in Germany where game design is very big, parts of the US, there are places in which you can make an educational game as an academic and get academic credit for it essentially as a professional. And so there is some value to doing it as well. And I just hope people just go out and do it. Once again, because I think it has a lot greater impact as well for sharing research and on the Islamic world and the Ottoman world in ways that traditional academic research doesn't have the same reach. And I think that reach is valuable and important. So.